Welcome back. In this video, we're going to be installing the electronic speed controller and the motors. So go ahead and get your hardware kit, and in it, you will find some little rubber dampeners, as we call them. These rubber dampeners help isolate the electronic stack from high frequency vibrations. So what we're going to do is install them first. The way they go in is there's a skinny side up here and a fat side down here. Okay, to install the rubber dampeners, you can use a pair of tweezers and one of your hex drivers to help push it down through the hole. They go in these 4 holes right here in the center. So put one side in, pinch it to push it down in there a little bit, and you can use your driver to help push the rest of it down through the hole so that it seats in just like this right here. Remember, the skinny side will be up and the bigger side will be down on the bottom. So go ahead and put all 4 of those in. Try to be careful to not tear them up or rip them as you're putting them in. It can be a little bit tricky, but just take your time. Alright, once those are all installed, then you can move on to the next part of mounting the electronic speed controller. And once you have the rubber dampeners installed, you're going to need to get the M2 by 18 screws out of your hardware kit. They look like this. They're 2mm by 18. So you'll need 4 of those. You can go ahead and push them up through the bottom of the rubber dampeners. So it'll look like this, with the 4 screws sticking out. Then, once you have all 4 of those screws in, look in your hardware kit and find some little 2mm plastic nuts. You'll need 4 of them, and go ahead and screw those down onto the 2mm screws. They don't need to be super tight, just get them a little bit snug. You don't want to squish the rubber dampeners because that will decrease their effectiveness. Just get them loosely finger tight. Once those nuts are on, you can put the ESC on. So go ahead and take the ESC out of the bag, and you can place the ESC. There's only one way it can go on. You've got those capacitors right there and there. They go down through the holes on the left side of the frame. So you can go ahead and put the ESC on like that. So it should look like this. Now, to hold the ESC in place, you're going to need 4 plastic nuts. In your hardware kit, there's a few different sizes. This is the correct size. It's 5mm, but if you just look for the shortest plastic hex nut, that'll be the right one. You can also double check the measurements if you have a pair of calipers or a ruler with metric measurements. So go ahead and screw those down onto the top of the ESC. You might need to use a driver to hold the screw in place while you're screwing these down. Just get them finger tight, good and snug, but don't over tighten. Alright, now we're ready to mount the motors. So go ahead and grab the motors out of the boxes. Now the motors we're using are the Emax Pulsar 2306 2400 kV motors. These motors are unique because they have LEDs built into the bottom of the motor, which are fun for flying in low light situations. You can choose between red, white, or blue plastic guards. Just for fun, we're going to use the white ones. Put the plastic guard on the bottom of the motor, and then you're going to need to find the hardware. Now your motors come with 3 bags of hardware. One is the prop nut, another one are 3mm screws, and the last one is 4mm screws. Now because the carbon fiber arms are a little bit thick, we're going to be using the 4mm screws. Now when installing your motors, it's generally a good practice to use something called Loctite. The Loctite we're using on these screws is medium strength blue Loctite. You can find it online or in our kit or at your local hardware store. Loctite is the thing that you put on the threads of the screws and help the screws stay in place and not vibrate out. Now because your motors vibrate a lot, they tend to, over time, loosen themselves. So the Loctite helps prevent that, and it's a good idea on all your drones to use Loctite on the motor screws. So go ahead and get 4 of the 4mm screws out. Get your motor and the frame and kind of position it in place, and then you want to get your 2mm driver. I like to put the screw on the driver and then put just a little dab of Loctite on the end of the screw. Doesn't take a lot, just a little bit, enough to get one side of the threads wet. Then go ahead and put your first screw in and tighten it down just finger tight loosely so you can still wiggle your motor around to align the screw holes. And just repeat the process until all your screws are in. It's important to have your motor wires aligned with the arm like this. And once you get all the screws in, you can go ahead and tighten them down good and snug. Just make sure that your driver is seated fully in the screw head so you don't strip it. So go ahead and install the rest of the motors. Remember your little motor guards, and go ahead and basically just repeat that process for the remaining 3 motors. Alright, now that we've got all 4 motors installed, what I like to do is zip tie the motor wires down to hold them in place before we solder them. So get 4 zip ties, then just lay the motor wires down flat along the arms and zip tie them in place. I like to make the wires nice and neat, so it'll look something like that. You can go ahead and clip off the excess zip tie. So do that on all four sides. One important thing to note while you're zip tying is making sure the wires go around the front of these two screws in the back. Now that we've got the wires zip tied down, we're going to take a look at where the wires actually solder onto the ESC. You can see on the ESC 6 sets of solder pads. 3 here, 3 here, 3 right here, and 3 right here. This is where the wires solder onto. Now it doesn't matter which wire goes to which pad, but I like to measure out the wires and give myself a little bit of slack. So as you can see here, I laid the wire down and brought it to this pad in the center on this side. You can either mark the wires with a pair of tweezers or just clip it off right there if you can get the clippers in there. But I'm just going to mark the wires where I want to cut. So go ahead and cut that to length. And you can see that by the time I get the wire stripped and soldered down, it will be nice and neat, tucked in right there. So do this with each of the wires. Kind of lay them in there, nice and neat, and then measure and mark with your tweezers where to cut the wire. When I mark the wires with the tweezers, I basically just pinch the wire and slide the tweezers off, and that creates a little line that I can see on the wire, and that's where I cut it. Do this with all 3 wires, cut them to length, just like that. Now we're going to go ahead and do this on all of the motor wires. So just lay it down in there so that it looks nice and neat. Mark it and cut it to length. Try to be really careful while doing this because once you cut the motor wires, if you cut it too short, it can be really tricky to try to lengthen them again. So make sure you measure twice before you cut. And maybe give yourself a little bit of slack just in case you're worried about them being too short. Alright, now I've done the front motors first because the back ones are a little bit tricky because you have to make sure that they're laid down really nice and neat because the canopy needs to sit down on top of the press nuts without pinching the wires. So it's a good idea to do the front motors first and then just pay special attention when you're doing the back motors so that the wire goes around the press nut and over to the pad so that it won't get pinched by the canopy. So lay the wire down, mark it, and cut. So just take your time on this step, don't rush it. Make sure your wires are long enough and that they go around the press nut flush with the carbon plate. That way they'll look nice and neat and they'll be out of the way when you go to install the canopy. So it should look something like this. You can even test fit the canopy and see that it sits flat against the top of the press nuts. That way you know that you've got your wires out of the way and in a good spot. Let's go ahead and do the last wires. Remember, don't be afraid to give yourself a little extra slack if you're worried. Now remember, you can lay the wires out and just do a test fit. Make sure that the canopy will go on. It looks like we got them good. Now it should look something like this when you're done cutting your motor wires. Next, we're going to tin the pads, strip and tin the wires, and then solder the wires on. Now that we've gotten to this point, there's just one more thing we need to do before we solder the motor wires down to the ESC, and that is to install the battery connector. So go ahead and take the ESC back off, and this is a step you can do before you do the battery wires or after. It doesn't matter. We're just going to do it right now. You're going to need to take the ESC off, and you can see on the bottom of the ESC there's a positive and a negative pad. So the red goes to the positive, the black goes to the negative. I like to give this wire a little bit of a twist just to help keep it together and look nice and neat, kind of like this. So what you're going to want to do is get your soldering iron nice and hot. I have it set to 400 degrees Celsius, which is a little bit on the hot side, but for soldering, especially the negative terminal, you're going to need a good amount of heat. So go ahead and tin the pads on the ESC with solder. The negative side has quite a bit of copper underneath it, so you're going to need to hold your iron on until you can see the solder flowing. Positive side should go a lot faster. Now these wires are oftentimes pre-tinned, but you might have to tin them. So to solder this on, the way I like to do it is get a nice clean tip using your tip cleaner or sponge and put the positive wire on top of the positive pad and put the tip on top of the wire and hold it there until the solder underneath it melts. Just like that. And the wires will heat up, so try not to burn your fingers. So now the positive side's on, we'll do the negative. This side is going to take quite a bit of heat to get it to solder down, so make sure you keep the soldering iron on long enough to melt the solder on the pad. You can even add a little bit of solder if you need to help things flow. Now you're going to want to inspect these connections and make sure there's no shorts or bridges. And a short or a bridge is simply just a blob of solder that jumps over and touches something else, like these capacitors, or you want to make sure there's definitely no bridges or shorts in between the two pads. So right now it's looking really good. And if there are any shorts or bridges, you basically just need to put your soldering iron back on and either remove it, clean the excess solder off and start again, or use your iron to heat up the solder and remove the excess solder. Alright, now that you've got your battery connector soldered on, you can go ahead and put the ESC back on. So put your ESC back on using the small hex standoff nuts. Get them snug down, finger tight. Then what we need to do is strip the motor wires so we can solder them onto the ESC. And when you're stripping these, only strip off about 2 millimeters of the insulation. You don't need a lot of the wire hanging out. You don't want too much, then you run the risk of getting shorts. So only strip off about 2 millimeters of the insulation. Should look something like this. So go ahead and strip off 2 millimeters of insulation on all the wires. Alright, now that your wires are all stripped, you're going to want to tin the wires. So get your soldering iron and your solder, and now tinning the wires just kind of preps the wire to be ready to solder onto the ESC. It's just putting some solder on the tip of the wire to make sure that all the strands hold together when you're manipulating it into place. Doesn't take a lot of solder, just make sure that there's enough to hold all the strands in place. And I like to work with a clean tip, so you can clean your tip often. Now that you've tinned your wires, you'll also want to tin the pads that the wire's attached to. Now like I said before, these are these 3 sets of pads. So go ahead and tin those. You don't want a big blob of solder, but just enough so that when you put the wires on, you don't have to add much or any extra solder to the pads. When you're doing the pads on the front, be careful not to hit the camera mount with your soldering iron because it will melt. So it's best if you bring your soldering iron in from one side or the other. And also be careful of this connector in front. Try not to hit that with your soldering iron either. Also, a quick soldering tip is when you're soldering, you want to try to keep the soldering iron as flat as possible. You don't want to use just the very tip. You want to use about 2 millimeters of the tip. So as you can see, I'm bringing the tip in flat and getting it on the pad so that there's more heat transfer like that. You can start soldering the motor wires down. So to do this, I like to get a pair of tweezers to grasp the wire and hold it in place while I'm soldering. So you want to get a little bit of solder on the tip of your soldering iron, move the wire into place, and try to heat up both the wire and the pad at the same time. It's like that. Now the way we cut these wires, there's going to be a longer wire, a medium-sized wire, and a shorter wire. The longer wires I always put on the inside pads right here. So once you get that wire down, get the medium-sized wire, solder it down. Then lastly, do the shortest wire on the outside pad. So it should look nice and neat like that once you've got it. Go ahead and continue to solder on all the wires until they're all on.